A red wooden car at the back of the train. A cupola window at dawn. A man in blue overalls leaning out, waving back at a boy on a bicycle who had skipped school to watch the westbound roll through. For 120 years, every freight train in America ended the same way. The caboose was office, bunkhouse, rear-end lookout, and the rolling symbol of the American railroad. But in the spring of 1984, a small orange box bolted to the rear coupler did what a century of diesel power could not. It ended all of it. This is the story of how a $25 a day device called F.R.E.D killed the American caboose. The story starts in upstate New York in the 1840s. The Auburn and Syracuse Railroad was one of the early American lines, hauling grain and lumber between the Finger Lakes and the Erie Canal. Their conductor was a man named Nat Williams. Williams had a problem that every railroad in the country would eventually have to solve. He needed somewhere to work. A conductor in the 1840s handled a lot of paperwork. He carried the waybills, the manifests, the signal flags, the lanterns, the brake rigging tools. He also had to ride the train for 15, sometimes 20 hours at a stretch. He had to read, write, eat, and sleep. Williams solved it the way railroad men solved most things in the 1800s. He improvised. He took a plain wooden boxcar, cut a door into the side of it, built himself a wooden bench, installed a desk, and bolted a cast iron stove to the floor. The rest of the crew slept in it, cooked in it, and rode up the day's freight in it. Williams borrowed an old Dutch sailor-s word for the galley of a ship and called the car a caboose. By the 1860s, every major American railroad had its own version. The Pennsylvania, the Baltimore, and Ohio, the Central Pacific. Each line built them a little differently, but the purpose was the same. A rolling wooden office at the back of every freight train. Therefore, the caboose spread. Then, in the winter of 1863, a conductor on the Chicago and Northwestern named T.B. Watson made the single modification that every American would picture for the next 120 years. Watson was rolling east across Iowa when a heavy load on one of his forward boxcars shifted. He could not see it from the floor of his caboose. By the time his train reached the next division point, the damage amounted to thousands of dollars in ruined freight. At the next stop, Watson stacked a couple of empty wooden shipping crates on top of the caboose roof, climbed up, cut a hole in the ceiling, and watched the train from a makeshift wooden tower. Within 5 years, every American caboose had a cupola. The cupola is the feature every American old enough to remember can still picture. That little second story, hip-high windows on all 4 sides, a narrow bench for the brakemen to stretch out on. From up there, a man could see the whole train, every boxcar, every coupler, every wheel. The rising column of heat from an overheating bearing, the blue smoke from a sticking brake shoe, the glint of a loose steel band on a flat carload. For the next 100 years, the caboose was the watchful eye at the back of every American freight train. And the sound of it was unmistakable. The chatter of iron wheels over jointed rail, ka-thunk, every 39 feet. The low whine of the coal stove pipe in a crosswind. The squeal of flanges on a tight curve as a 200-ton car leaned into the iron. A conductor could fall asleep in the cupola of a caboose on a division run and wake up knowing exactly where he was on the railroad, just from the rhythm of the rail joints under the wheels. The caboose was where paperwork got signed, where coffee got drunk at 2 in the morning on a Montana grade, where a brakeman warmed his hands after setting a handbrake in freezing rain, where a conductor wrote up the day's switch list on an old roll-top desk bolted to the wall, and it was where the ritual happened. Every boy who grew up near a set of American tracks between 1900 and 1980 can tell the same story. You would hear the horn from a mile off, drop your bicycle at the crossing, and wait for the train to pass. 60, 80, 100 boxcars. And then, at the very end, the red caboose. The man in the cupola would lean out the window and wave at you. It was an unwritten rule. Every American railroad man waved back. Conductors, brakemen, even the grumpy ones. One commenter on a video about the caboose's disappearance, a man in his 70s, wrote that he could still remember the faces that waved at him from a cupola window between 1948 and 1962. More than 400 people agreed with him. That ritual was not a small thing. It was the human face of a freight train. The proof that behind all that iron and diesel was a working man doing a job, and that man saw you. By the 1960s, roughly 50,000 cabooses were in active service on American railroads. Every one of them required a minimum crew of 2, a conductor and a rear brakeman. 12 separate railroad unions held contracts that guaranteed their presence. Federal Railroad Administration regulations required them. The caboose was not a nostalgic object. It was a legally mandated, contractually protected, century-old fixture of American commerce. Therefore, by the 1960s, the caboose was not just equipment. It was a contract, a tradition, and in the view of a dozen American railroad unions, a guarantee that would never be broken. But that guarantee was already being eroded by a technology nobody in the caboose had noticed. In the late 1950s, the American Association of Railroads began installing a new kind of trackside equipment along the main lines. It was a low gray box mounted on a steel post about 2 feet off the ground, positioned every 20 to 40 miles along the right-of-way. Inside were 2 infrared sensors pointed up toward the undercarriage of every passing train. As each wheel set rolled by, the sensors measured the temperature of the bearing. If a bearing was overheating, if it was turning into what railroad men called a hot box, the detector would radio the locomotive cab in real time. By 1968, the Burlington Northern had detectors on most of its mainline mileage. The Union Pacific followed. The Santa Fe followed. Within a decade, a freight train could cross 2,000 miles of American railroad and be scanned by dozens of automated hot box detectors, every one of them watching for the exact problem the rear brakeman in the cupola had been posted to watch for. 100 years of human observation replaced by a gray box on a fence post. But the hot box detector only solved one of the caboose's jobs. It could not read brake line air pressure. It could not flash a rear marker light. It could not signal the locomotive engineer that the train was still intact and had not broken in two on a grade. For those jobs, a different technology was being developed in a small electronics company on Prince Edward Island in eastern Canada. The company was called Pulse Electronics. In the 1970s, their engineers built a device that would eventually fit in a box the size of a lunch pail and clamp directly onto the rear coupler of any American freight car. The box had a pressure transducer wired into the brake line. It had a radio transmitter. It had a photovoltaic panel to keep its battery charged. And it had a high-intensity LED strobe light visible for more than a mile down the right-of-way. It did 4 things. It read the air pressure in the train line. It transmitted that reading to the locomotive cab every few seconds. It flashed a red marker light at the rear of the train. And the entire assembly weighed under 30 pounds, light enough for a single yard worker to lift onto a coupler by hand. Everything a caboose and its crew had been doing at the back of a freight train, the Pulse Electronics unit could do with a 9-volt signal and a sheet of solar cells. The railroad industry called it the end-of-train device, ETD or EOT. Official, bureaucratic, forgettable, but the men in the yards gave it a different name. Stand on any siding in the American West in 1984 and ask a retired conductor what was clamped to the back of that freight train, and he would not say end of train device. He would say F.R.E.D. The railroads themselves eventually used the polite version, flashing rear end device, in their training manuals. The real version was the one the crews used in the break room, frickin' rear end device, because the crews knew exactly what the box was for. F.R.E.D. was an orphan. A small, weather-beaten orange thing bolted to a coupler knuckle, blinking red into the dark where the conductor used to stand. It did not speak, and it did not wave. It could not tell a brakeman a story about the grade it had just come down. It just chirped. A short burst of digital telemetry every few seconds up to the locomotive cab, reporting brake pressure and battery state. That was the entire conversation. The sound of a caboose had been iron wheels on jointed rail and a coal stove pipe whining in the wind. The sound of F.R.E.D. was a radio hiss and a half-second chirp, and the absence of boots on a cupola ladder. Inside the boardrooms of every Class I railroad, the economics were all anybody could talk about. In the late 1970s, a caboose cost a railroad roughly $50,000 per crew position per year. Conductors' wages, brakemen's wages, health benefits, pension contributions, hotel allowances at division points, maintenance of the car itself, fuel to drag its empty 20-ton weight around the country. A typical Class I railroad was running thousands of freight trains a day. Each one required a minimum of 2 caboose positions on every shift. The math, when the Burlington Northern's accounting department finally ran it in the late 1970s, was catastrophic for every man in a blue coat. A pulse electronics end-of-train device, amortized across its service life with battery swaps and routine servicing, came out to roughly $25 a day. $25 a day to do what 2 American railroad men in a wooden rolling office had done for 120 years. Therefore, the calculation became irresistible. A single Class I railroad could save hundreds of millions of dollars a year by clamping a $25 device to the back of every freight train and sending every man in every caboose home. But the railroads had a problem. 12 separate railroad unions held contracts guaranteeing caboose crews. The Federal Railroad Administration required them by regulation. 50 years of labor peace depended on the premise that a human being at the back of a freight train was a federal safety requirement, not a line item on an accounting spreadsheet. The railroads couldn't just fire tens of thousands of men. They had to prove, in front of the federal government, that the man in the cupola was no longer necessary. And that's when the cameras started appearing. Sometime in the late 1970s, small hidden cameras began showing up in yard lighting fixtures, in trackside signal boxes, and in the coupler housings along certain stretches of Burlington Northern and Santa Fe Main Line. Nobody told the crews. Nobody needed to. The cameras were pointed up at the cupola windows of every caboose that rolled past, up at the rear platforms, up at the doors. The railroads weren't looking for safety violations. They were looking for footage, and they were going to need it. Therefore, in the fall of 1982, the Federal Railroad Administration opened formal hearings on the petition from the American Association of Railroads to eliminate the mandatory caboose. The hearings were held in Washington. The petition itself was unglamorous bureaucratic paperwork, but the men who traveled to sit in that hearing room understood exactly what was at stake. On one side of the aisle sat the legal teams of the Burlington Northern, the Union Pacific, the Santa Fe, the Southern Pacific, and the Conrail system. On the other side sat the officers of the United Transportation Union, the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen, the Brotherhood of Railroad Signalmen, and 9 other labor organizations representing a combined membership of more than 200,000 American railroad workers. Both sides had spent more than a year preparing. The unions went first. They brought photographs of derailments caught by Caboose crews. They brought accident reports, some going back 50 years, of rear-end collisions prevented by a brakeman spotting trouble from a cupola window. They brought safety statistics from the Federal Railroad Administration's own files, showing that every year Caboose crews reported hundreds of mechanical defects that trackside detectors had missed. They brought a 63-year-old retired conductor from the Northern Pacific who testified for nearly an hour about what it meant to sit in a cupola on a winter night in Montana and watch the train for the one thing that could kill the engineer. They brought engineering studies. They brought doctors. They brought wives and widows. The union case took 3 days to present, and by the end of it, any reasonable observer in that hearing room would have said the caboose was safe. But then the railroads opened their briefcases. The railroads did not argue the safety data. They did not dispute the accident reports. They did not contest a single statistic the unions had introduced. Instead, the railroads rolled in a projector. What followed was more than 2 hours of videotape, grainy black and white footage, hidden camera footage. Some of it was shot from yard lighting fixtures. Some of it was shot from coupler housings on the locomotives ahead of the cabooses themselves. And every frame of it showed the same thing: caboose crews asleep in the cupola, caboose crews reading newspapers with their feet on the stove, caboose crews playing cards. A brakeman in Wyoming slumped against a window with his mouth open. A conductor in Nebraska eating a sandwich with his back turned to the train. A pair of crewmen in North Dakota who appeared to have taken off their boots and were warming their feet against the coal stove while their freight train rolled across 140 miles of empty prairie. The footage had been collected over a span of more than 2 years. It represented, by the railroad's own admission, less than 1% of total caboose crew man-hours. It had been culled down to the worst possible 2 hours the railroads could assemble. And it was devastating, because the railroads were not arguing that every caboose crew slept on duty. They were arguing something far worse for the unions. They were arguing that there was no way to tell, from outside the cupola, whether the crew was doing its job or not. A trackside hotbox detector, they said, did its job every single time a train passed it. A man in a cupola, the projector said, sometimes did and sometimes did not. By the afternoon of the 4th day of hearings, the union case was effectively finished. The Federal Railroad Administration issued its ruling in 1985. The mandatory caboose requirement was lifted. Individual railroads were permitted to replace the caboose with any end-of-train device that met a new federal technical standard. And the 12 unions that had protected the caboose for 100 years were left with a single consolation. The ruling grandfathered existing caboose crews into retirement or reassignment rather than firing them outright. Then the rollout began. The Burlington Northern moved first. In the spring of 1984, even before the final Federal Railroad Administration ruling, Burlington Northern had already begun equipping its freight fleet with Pulse Electronics EOT devices under an advance federal waiver. By the end of that year, nearly 40% of Burlington Northern road trains were rolling without a caboose. The Union Pacific followed in 1985 and the Santa Fe in the same year. The Southern Pacific came shortly after. By 1988, roughly 3/4 of all American Class I freight trains were equipped with an end-of-train device in place of a caboose. By 1990, the red caboose was effectively gone from mainline American railroading. The numbers under those years are the part that is easy to miss. In the 6 years between 1984 and 1990, tens of thousands of conductors, rear brakemen, and caboose-specific positions were eliminated from American railroads. Entire shop crafts that built, repaired, and maintained cabooses were closed. Small-town car shops in places like Havre, Montana, Pocatello, Idaho, and Cheyenne, Wyoming, where the red caboose had been a local industry, shut their doors. A class of American working men, the caboose crew railroader, was legislated out of existence by a projector, a federal hearing room, and a $25 box clamped to the back of a coupler. The caboose itself became a condemned witness, convicted in a courtroom by a camera pointed at its own eyelid, and the country, for the most part, did not notice. If you are finding this interesting, hit the subscribe button. This channel covers forgotten American machines every week, the ones that built the country and quietly disappeared. More stories like this are coming, because the railroads had won. But winning the hearing room turned out to be the easy part. What happened next on the rails themselves was something nobody in 1985 had planned for. Because once the caboose was gone, the American freight train started doing something the railroads had always wanted it to do, but had never quite been allowed to. It started getting longer. In 1980, the average American Class I freight train ran somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 feet, roughly a mile to a mile and a bit. That length was not a technological ceiling. It was a practical one. A caboose crew at the back of a train, more than a mile long, was already at the outer edge of what a human being could safely ride. The slack action on a long train, the compression and stretching of 1,000 feet of coupler knuckles as the locomotive brakes applied and released, was already throwing brakemen against the cupola walls on hard applications. A retired Burlington Northern engineer with 43 years on the property later described it bluntly. On a long train, he said, the slack action between cars would throw a human being around the interior of a caboose like a rag doll. After 1990, with the caboose gone, the constraint was gone. Freight trains began growing. By 1995, the average Class I road train was running about 6,500 feet. By 2005, 7,000. By 2015, more than 9,000. By the early 2020s, some precision-scheduled railroading operations on the Union Pacific and the CSX were running freight trains of 15,000 feet, nearly 3 miles long. A single diesel locomotive at the front, 2 or 3 distributed power units in the middle and at the rear, and 250 boxcars strung between them. The physics of the slack action on a 3-mile freight train is violent. When the lead locomotive applies air to the brake line, that command signal travels back through the train line at roughly the speed of sound in compressed air. On a 100-car train, the rear end is braking within a second of the front. On a 250-car train, that same command takes several seconds to reach the last coupler. During those seconds, the front of the train is slowing down, while the rear of the train is still rolling at full speed. 16,000 tons of freight compress into the couplers in front of them. Then, on release, they stretch apart again. A steel coupler knuckle can move between 6 and 12 inches during a single slack event. Multiplied across 250 cars, that adds up to more than 100 feet of accordion motion rolling through the train in about 4 seconds. A human being in a caboose at the rear of a train like that doesn't just get shaken. He gets broken. Ribs against cupola rails, heads against window panes. The interior of a caboose at the end of a 3-mile precision-scheduled railroading train would be, in the plain language of every locomotive engineer who's ever run one, an unsurvivable place to put a person. Therefore, F.R.E.D. didn't just beat the caboose on cost. F.R.E.D. won because by 2010 it had become physically impossible to put a human being at the back of an American freight train and expect him to live through the trip. That's the part the 1982 hearing room never discussed. The railroads argued economics and surveillance, but the real engine of the caboose's death wasn't the $25 box. It was the 3-mile train the $25 box made possible. The unions had been right. They had just been right. Right about a danger that was still 20 years away. But the consequences of eliminating the caboose did not stay at the back of the train. They moved forward to the cab of the locomotive and into every small American town that still had a grade crossing. Under modern American railroad operating rules, a freight train of 15,000 feet is typically crewed by exactly 2 people, a locomotive engineer and a conductor. Both of them sit in the lead locomotive, and when something goes wrong somewhere in the middle or the rear of that train, the conductor is the one who walks. In 1980, a mechanical problem 3/4 of the way back on a freight train was somebody's job who was already sitting 3/4 of the way back on the freight train. A rear brakeman in a caboose could climb down, walk 50 cars, solve the problem, and be back in his cupola in 20 minutes. In 2025, a mechanical problem in the middle of a 2.5-mile freight train is a 45-minute walk, one way, for the single conductor on duty. If he finds a knuckle pin failure and has to replace the knuckle itself, a 90-pound steel part he has to carry back on foot. The total duration of the incident can stretch past 3 hours. During every minute of that 3-hour window, the train sits stopped across every grade crossing it is currently occupying. A retired Union Pacific conductor, writing publicly about the disappearance of the caboose, explained the math. A 3-mile freight train, he said, occupies between 4 and 6 small town-grade crossings simultaneously. When that train breaks down, 4 to 6 small American towns are cut in half for as long as it takes one exhausted conductor to walk to the problem and walk back. Ambulances cannot cross. Fire trucks cannot cross. School buses cannot cross. The grocery store on the north side of the tracks is unreachable from the post office on the south side. Every American who has ever waited in a car for 90 minutes at a blocked grade crossing, furious at the railroad for what seemed like criminal indifference, was actually waiting for a consequence engineered in a Washington hearing room in 1982. And the final twist of the story was this. The caboose wasn't the only casualty of the rollout. The device that had killed it, the original one-way F.R.E.D, was itself on borrowed time. The first-generation end-of-train devices could only transmit information forward. They could tell the engineer what the rear brake pressure was. They could flash their red marker light. They couldn't actually do anything. They had no ability to apply the rear brakes independently. That turned out to matter. Across the late 1980s and early 1990s, a series of rear-end collisions and runaway train incidents made it clear to the Federal Railroad Administration that one-way communication was not enough. A train descending a long mountain grade with a front-only brake command had an asymmetric brake application, and the slack action that followed was, in several documented cases, catastrophic. In 1997, the Federal Railroad Administration mandated that all trains operating above certain speeds or on certain grades be equipped with two-way end-of-train devices. The two-way units cost roughly 3 to 4 times what the original F.R.E.D had cost. They required upgraded radio systems, encrypted command signals, and new battery chemistries. The original Orange Pulse electronics box was retired across most of the American network by the early 2000s. F.R.E.D had killed the caboose, and then F.R.E.D's own children killed F.R.E.D. The ghost had outlived its executioner by less than 15 years. But the caboose wasn't entirely gone. When the Burlington Northern began retiring its fleet in 1984, it had roughly 3,500 cabooses in active service. The Union Pacific had another 2,000. The Santa Fe, the Southern Pacific, the Chessie System, the Norfolk Southern, and Conrail. Together, the American Class I railroads owned something close to 15,000 cabooses at the moment the Federal Railroad Administration lifted the mandate. None of them were going to be melted down right away. The railroads almost immediately began selling them. In 1985, a working steel-bodied caboose in reasonable condition could be bought from a Burlington Northern surplus auction for somewhere between $200 and $500. Wooden cabooses, already being phased out for insurance reasons, went even cheaper. An entire generation of rolling wooden offices, some built in the 1920s, some built in the 1940s, some still painted in their original road colors, was sold to farmers, hobbyists, scout troops, small-town historical societies, and retired railroad men who wanted to keep a piece of the job that had just been taken from them. They ended up in every quiet corner of the country. Drive the back roads of Nebraska today, and you might find a red Burlington Northern caboose serving as a backyard guest cabin on a wheat farm outside Lincoln. Drive through the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and you can find a green Chesapeake and Ohio caboose painted into a children's reading room behind a rural library. In Chama, New Mexico, along the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad, a row of Denver and Rio Grande Western cabooses has been converted into a lodging complex where travelers pay to sleep in a cupola bunk bed. By Preservation Society estimates, more than 2,000 American cabooses are still physically intact today, scattered across backyards, tourist lines, and private museums from Maine to California. A few hundred are operational on tourist railroads. About 1,000 are stationary installations. The rest are slowly decomposing in fence lines behind old depots, paint peeling, cupola glass broken, waiting for somebody to decide whether they are worth saving. The tourist lines kept them running. The Durango and Silverton narrow gauge in Colorado still puts a caboose on the back of every passenger train that climbs the Animas River Canyon. The Cumbres and Toltec, crossing the Colorado and New Mexico border, still runs a wooden caboose at the rear of its tourist consist. The East Broad Top in Pennsylvania, after decades of silence, is running cabooses again. The Strasburg Railroad, the Cass Scenic Railroad in West Virginia, the Grand Canyon Railway. A dozen small gauge and heritage lines across the country, most of them nonprofit and most operating on a weekend schedule, still end every train the way American freight trains ended for 120 years. A kid on a bicycle in Chama or Durango or Strasburg can still drop his bike at the crossing, wait for the train, and get a wave from a man in a cupola window. The waving rule is still in force on those railroads. Every conductor knows it. No nonprofit board ever had to write it down. And then there is the collector community. There is an entire subculture of retired American railroad men, model railroaders, industrial historians, and vintage machine hobbyists who have spent the last 40 years rescuing, restoring, and documenting the American caboose. Online forums with tens of thousands of members. Annual gatherings in places like Galesburg, Illinois, and Altoona, Pennsylvania, where owners trailer their restored cabooses onto temporary track for a weekend. Oral history projects recording the last surviving caboose crewmen in their 80s and 90s before their generation is gone. Preservation efforts and private collectors have kept the caboose alive, even as freight railroading moved on without it. Private museums in places you would never expect, a converted caboose in a Wyoming pasture that holds a complete archive of a division superintendent's paperwork from the 1950s donated by his grandson. That preserved caboose is a reminder of how personal railroad life once was. The caboose is the single most rescued piece of American railroad rolling stock in history. More cabooses have been preserved per capita than steam locomotives, than passenger cars, than interurban streetcars, than any other category of retired American railroading. Because the caboose was never really about transportation. It was about the people who rode in it, and that is what America actually traded in 1982. The red Caboose did not just lose to a cheaper box. It lost to a country that decided a human being at the back of a freight train was a luxury it could not afford. It lost to 3-mile trains that nobody could safely ride. It lost to an accounting department in a Seattle office tower, a projector in a Washington hearing room, and a quiet agreement, never quite spoken out loud, that the men in blue coats were replaceable. What the country got in exchange was a small orange box that chirped once every few seconds and flashed a red light into the dark where a conductor used to lean out a cupola window and wave. The sound of an American freight train used to be iron on jointed rail and a coal stove pipe whining in the wind. The sound of one now is a radio hiss, a digital telemetry burst, and a diesel horn fading into a small town with its main street blocked for the next 2 hours. If you stand at a grade crossing anywhere in the American West on a cold morning and watch a 2-mile Union Pacific manifest roll past, you can still see the red light at the end of the train. It is not a man in a cupola anymore. It is a weather-beaten plastic housing bolted to a coupler knuckle. It is still watching the train. It is just not watching you back.